welcome everyone to the fourth and final week of our mini course on excavating and discovery at the Temple of the Goddess Mut. So this week I'm going to try and jam pretty much everything into a final. So I do fear that there's an awful lot here, but we'll try and see what we get through. The first thing I want to do, however, is everyone has now become familiar with seeing what the Mut precinct looks like, and especially from an aerial. And you'll notice that we do have the temple of Ramses III, which is part of the precinct, and that's right here, which we really haven't talked about. We didn't work there but a few years, and when we did, we were looking to see whether that temple was sited over top of one that had been there earlier. We really did very little other than to sort of excavate where we could beneath paving. We weren't going to take things down, but as you take a sight line down the central axis of the temple, wherever there was not paving blocks and we could access, we actually did remove and look to see what was down, to see if it were possible to indicate whether or not there were an earlier building. We didn't actually find one, but what we did find was a statue of the king who built this temple, Ramses III, which had been very carefully cut up into pieces in the Roman period. It was Roman pottery was associated with it, and so we were able to take out those pieces. And Lutfi Hassan, conservator who had worked with us and as well as with Chicago House, put the pieces back together that we had. We later on did get a few extra pieces, which the statue is now in the Luxor Museum. The piece that we got later is a portion of this arm. Unfortunately, they have not had the chance to reconnect that. But it is a statue of the king holding in front of him. I know you can't see it very well, but it's a small figure of a mummiform god, whom we learned from the niche at the back of the central axis is in fact Amen-Ipit. That is a creator form, an ithyphallic creator form of the god Amen, who appears wearing a mummy shroud. And the king is actually shown in that niche, both in front of that god and also holding that god, just as our statue does. And so we're fairly sure that this actually was the cult statue of the temple of Ramses III. And you remember the statue of Queen T, which we also found in the on the porch, also probably discarded there in the Roman period. And a third final statue that I haven't had a chance to mention is this one, which is a private person's statue, a man who lived in the middle of the 18th dynasty in the time of Hatshepsut herself. And this statue has a funny history because it was found in a trench, which was almost certainly a trench like that which Benson and Gourley had excavated back in the 19th century. But it had been found in around 1950 by Henri Chevrier, who published a tiny note about it, a very short paragraph, as I learned several years after we found it. But I think he thought it was of such little importance that he actually put it back in the trench and covered it up. So when we were doing our work, we actually came upon it, and it's actually quite a very interesting statue, as you can see from the beautifully inscribed inscription on the side. And what's wonderful is that it describes our goddess and calls her the powerful one, Sekhmet Bastet Wajid, the first lady of Atum, who strews the two lands with the electrum of her face. And all of those are epithets of Mut herself, just confirming what we already knew, that she went by all of those names in the time of Hatshepsut. So these are some of the questions that we raised earlier that had not been answered by Benson and Gourley, and that I'm going to address a little bit today. Why was the sacred lake shaped like a crescent moon? How did the Temple of Mut relate to the Temple of Amun-Re at Karnak nearby and the Luxor Temple? How long did the Mut Temple operate, and how was it changed over time? I can't really address the second half of that. What was the relationship, although just for time purposes, what was the relationship between the lion-headed form of the goddess and the anthropomorphic one? What were the functions of the overall precinct and its buildings? That's really bringing in what we did behind the sacred lake and that you are quite familiar with yourself now. Who were the original builders? We don't know their names, but we do know that it goes back to the Middle Kingdom, as we learned. How did Mut relate to Re and Amun-Re of Karnak? And I'll speak to that in just a few minutes. So let's first start with looking at the question of the lake. Why is it shaped like it is? And there are several possibilities that it was deliberately man-made that way. Some people had argued that it was an oxbow artifact of the river itself, i.e. a cut-off meander. And then there are other possibilities of natural development. So we have been very, very fortunate to have worked with an excellent group of people. Angus Graham and Judith Bunbury from the UK have done coring for us around the peninsula of the lake. And they also did one core between the Mut Temple and Karnak itself. So if you remember, we're looking at the Mut Temple, Karnak between them, and the nearness of the Nile River itself, which is the path, the Sphinx Alley path that goes to the Luxor Temple, goes right along, gets nearer and nearer to the Nile as you approach the Luxor Temple. So if you look at the Nile River from above, you actually begin to see right away the formation of islands in the Nile is a common feature. Even today, you actually see them forming right in front of your eyes. You can see here that this one is coming together as part of the land itself, but originated as an island. And the coring that Angus and Judith have done has been to look at this question of island formation, because they learned some years before. They worked for us around 2007-8. They had learned already that the Temple of Karnak originated as a sand island in the Nile. And then eventually the Nile moved westward, and therefore the land became larger and no longer on an island. Here you see where they did their cores, and you see where they did the core between the Mut Temple and Karnak itself. When they did those cores, they were able to bring up in a tiny, this is actually what the core looks like, so it's really quite small, but it brings up sediments that can go very, very deep, at least 12 meters deep and sometimes more. And what they were able to see is that in some cores, we have material that goes all the way down to the Middle Kingdom. And near the top, we have Roman, and as you can see here, actually a good deal of Third Intermediate period, not a surprise to us because that is when the 25th dynasty rulers were very active. But one of the things you notice is that New Kingdom to Roman ends up being beneath Third Intermediate Period to Ptolemaic. And that is one of the problems with coring, is that you often will get a sample that has been disturbed earlier and has been turned over by some other action. And so it's important to have people who can actually look at literally grain-sized pieces of pottery and know the fabrics well enough that they can do something with looking at them. So we did learn a great deal about a suggested Middle Kingdom date for the Moot Temple from the coring. Now, going back to this question of lake formation and just seeing it in action, when you look at the Nile and you consider that it is carrying sediments that is coming from the south, and as those sediments reach any kind of obstacle in the river, even if it's just slowness or something in the way, they begin to dump those sediments. And as they do so, you begin to have a buildup. Island formation is almost always the same, and it means that you will always dump the most amount of sediment towards whatever will be the down or upriver portion of the island eventually. And then usually a heavier group also at the downside. And in between, you tend to have a very boggy area that can be watery for an extremely long time. Those areas begin to then fuse over time, and the bogginess fills in, and you end up with an actual island. And this is Angus's drawing of how the Moot Island once upon a time looked. This would have been probably equivalent to Egypt's Old Kingdom or early dynastic period. And here is that of Karnak. We already knew that the area here in the southeast of Karnak enclosure had been studied well enough by all sorts of kinds of excavation that there was a river that went by here, and that had already been known, and they knew where the riverbank was at that time. So they've actually been able, through coring, to draw the original island that held the Karnak temple fairly accurately, and that dated back to the first buildings in the 11th dynasty around 2000 BC. Here in the Moot temple, we know that at least in the Middle Kingdom, there is already a temple. So one might say perhaps a couple of hundred years after the Karnak temple, or maybe even only 100 years after. But notice that the coring that they did in between indicated that that did not emerge as land as yet. In fact, even today, when you walk it, you are going from high ground to low ground between Moot and Karnak. This remained underwater at least until the beginning of the 18th dynasty seasonally, so that it was only in the time of Hatshepsut that you could actually, for most of the year, have dry land between these two temples. And that explains a great deal about why the processional spaces that happened between Karnak and Moot and then the Luxor temple developed only in the New Kingdom and later, because of the need for this land to actually become usable. So here again is a drawing that shows you how the river had moved, was originally over in this direction, forming these islands, and then moved westward. Now, when we go back and look historically at the Moot temple and how the Lake Ishiru behaved during the year before the building of the Aswan Dam, which didn't open until 1970, in 1930, in the spring, when there is very low water, or there was very low water, you could see that the lake is really quite shallow. This is the temple of Ramses III. and the lake is a far cry away from it. But as everyone knows, who knows anything about Egypt, the Nile flood starts to rise after the middle of July. And it is at its highest levels in the fall, October to November. And in November of 1922, October, sorry, of 1922, this is the entrance to the Ramses III temple, completely underwater, and the lake is throughout it. And that's a view in 2 years later, looking down the central axis, also in the month of October. So the lake was very much conditioned by the Nile River itself, its rise and its fall. And the Egyptians must have been very aware of this, and we do actually have one tomb in Deir el-Medina that dates to the reign of Ramses II that actually depicts the temple of the goddess Mut and the Ishiru. And here is the crescent-shaped or horseshoe-shaped almost lake that is around the temple itself. And you'll notice that there is a dock over here, and there is a dock over on this west side as well. And that is important to us because when we made a decision that we would actually drain the sacred lake in order to do some excavation, and more importantly, to control the water levels and keep it from rising and lowering so that it would stop damaging the stone in the temple, we were interested in sort of knowing where those docks might have been. So here's the area that we were able to excavate in 2008 and 9 at the time that we drained the lake. We excavated all of these squares. We excavated here, we excavated behind the central axis and over one square here, and then finally at the western dock, which is near the approach to the temple of Ramses III. So this is the area more or less just as we're getting started. There was already a visible dock there. And this is the eastern dock, which you saw on that tomb scene from Deir el-Medina, where the goddess's boat would have been placed when it started to do what the Egyptians called navigations, na'i, on the river. And as we began to work, you can see that not only is there a dock, but then leading away from it is a stone path made of large stone blocks. We found a few things in the lake. Unfortunately, we were unable to make the lake drain past more or less just the surface, about a few feet below the surface. And so we couldn't really do much excavating directly in the center of the lake. But when we saw things, we grabbed it. And here is Hiroko Korea, the conservator, when we've just grabbed a piece of large stone out of the water, or out of the middle of the lake. And it turned out to be the upper torso of a red granite statue inscribed for Ramses II, but recarved from a statue of Amenhotep III. And you can see this incredible lime that was on the surface, salting and lime on the surface, that Hiroko was able to actually remove after soaking it for a year and a half in water, distilled water. We also found this seated block statue of a ludus that dates to the 25th dynasty inside the lake. Very beautiful piece and very full of inscriptions, never been published as yet, working on it. And so here's what happened to us as we were working. When our pumps worked, we had nice dry area down in front of the docks that would allow us to do a lot of excavating on the perimeters. But all we needed to do was lose power for even half of a day, and the water came right back up immediately. So it was a bit of a trial doing this, and I'm happy to say that, however, at this point, we have stability in controlling the water. So here you can see the setup that we had to do this excavation. We ended up having to put a separate well into each and every square in order to control the water, which really would come pouring back at you. Here is that, that large key with the stone path leading away from it. And I can tell you that most of these blocks are inscribed. There is one with the cartouche of Taharqa in it, so we know that this was built after his reign, probably in the Ptolemaic period. But what is fascinating about this whole structure is that they added to it over time to begin to use it as a means of shoring up the peninsula on which the temple itself stood. And that becomes quite clear both on the east and on the west side of the peninsula. The other thing that we find is leading, here is the key itself, and then you see that it, just like at Karnak, it actually did have a staircase that allowed the priests to then enter into the lake to bathe every day to become ritually pure. So as you can see, as you move away from the key, we did not excavate all along here, but we picked areas, but we followed the stone path area. And as we followed them, what we found is that down here, it actually, the stone path curves and makes that turn just like the peninsula itself does. When we had to turn over a couple of these blocks, we tried to avoid doing so, but we actually did find that they were decorated. This one, because it had broken, we ended up taking and conserving, and it is in our open air museum, but we made the decision not to do that with most of it, and it's pretty much all underwater now. We then excavated behind the central axis, and when we did that, what we found is that there originally had been a stone staircase that came up from the lake that would have then entered into this small chapel, the so-called contra-temple. And interestingly, at a later time, they actually built, at the base of the staircase, they actually built what almost looks like a defensive glacis. It is small, broken up stone that is then welded together with mortars, which they must have found was much better at protecting the peninsula from sliding away into the lake itself. So this was an area that must have been utilized for at least 2,000 years, and clearly the lake was, and the water from the lake was a threat to it, just as it has been in modern times, and they did things to try and preserve it. We found as we were going up that hill this beautiful capital of a Hathor pillar, which is Ptolemaic in date and would have stood at the top of a small set of columns. We think probably at least two of them at the entrance. The other thing that we found is that underneath all of that glacis and at the base of that staircase is the continuing pathway itself. So the stone pathway did go all the way around the peninsula. Next, we moved over to the western dock and began to work there, as we were able to draw the water away in that area as well. And immediately came across a row of sandstone blocks that were out in front of, and very carefully laid out in front of the quay. And we think that probably this was actually a form of lining the entranceway into the lake from this quay to ensure its surface. What we found in the rest of the area around the peninsula is we actually found evidence of lime plaster on the floor of the lake itself. Now, lime plaster was not in use in Egypt until at least the Ptolemaic period, but it does look as if at a certain point they almost treated it like a large swimming pool that needed to have its own surface that was carefully maintained. Now, these blocks that you see here are also, like the ones we saw with the other key, decorated. And they turn out to actually be part of a chapel that belonged to King Hyrcanus of the 29th dynasty, who is very poorly attested. We probably have more Hyrcanus here than there is anywhere else in Egypt now. But it is inside of a key. So what do? Do you take a key apart, or do you just take one? And we took this one, which was from that barrage in front and not from the actual dock itself. As you can see, there actually was still paint on the surface, and this was in raised relief. Most of it is in sunken relief. And it does represent the god Khonsu, who is the offspring of Mut and Amun-Re, with the king in front. And we also do have scenes that have Sekhmet in them as well. So this is now the more or less steady state that the lake is maintained at. The pump goes on intermittently, and just as with Karnak and Luxor temples, we can maintain a water level that keeps the temple protected. It was for some reason not included in the original. Mut temple was not originally included in the plans for Karnak and Luxor. We never understood why, so we did it, and together with the American Research Center in Egypt. And so now you can go back to looking at this question of what we learned about the making of the temple and the connection between the two. So now when we see these processional spaces that take place between the Mut temple and Karnak, we know that this was not possible until the 18th dynasty, when there was land available to do it. And that, of course, then encouraged and enhanced a relationship between the god Amun-Re of Karnak and the goddess Mut of Ishiru. Now, in the time of Hatshepsut, this is what we see very often represented, is Mut as almost looking like a queen wearing a vulture headdress, embracing here Hatshepsut herself. But even on that limestone gate, she is called Mut, the mistress of Ishiru and Bastet, and almost certainly Sekhmet as well. So she does occur in the middle of the 18th dynasty, already as the lion-headed goddess and as the agent of the sun god. That is how she is described in most of the documentation we have. She's called Mut, Bastet, Sekhmet. And here she is on a doorway where you have, excuse me, where you have the god, the king, who is identified in the inscription as Thutmose III, although this has been recarved in the time of Ramses III, in front of the goddess with a leonine face. But if you look carefully, you may be able to see for yourself that there are at least two muzzles on this lion. And in fact, the goddess has been recarved more than once on this particular block. We have the traces here of all of the chisel marks that were left in the time of Akhenaten, when he sent his people in to remove any image and name of the goddess Mut from her blocks. So she's been restored here. Now, the restorations that began after the time of Akhenaten's mutilations transformed the Mut temple for the first time. Up until that moment, there had never been, as far as we can find, an image of the god Amun-Re inside the Temple of Mut. His name occurs on a few of the column drums that we have, but there is no representation of the god Amun-Re that dates before the time of Amenhotep III, the father of Akhenaten. Amenhotep III introduced Amun-Re into the Temple of Mut. But in the period following Akhenaten's reign, in the time of Tutankhamun and the god and the king Ai, etc., Amun became just as much a feature of the Temple of Mut as Mut had been herself. And this block on the right is a very telling one, because what you see here is Thutmose III, again identified in the cartouche, making a wine offering, and the offering is being made to Amun-Re. Now, for yourselves, you can see all the mutilations, so you know that this had been a different deity. But you may not believe me that this originally was a female deity, but I can promise you that it was, and the inscription verifies it, because the text actually says, "May she give all stability, all life, stability, dominion." So in every case that we have this, we find that originally Mut had been there, and in the restoration periods, they picked and chose to add Amun-Re, and they even added the goddess Amunet, which is a little bit of an insult to the goddess Mut. This is the only image of the goddess Amunet, the other consort of Amun-Re. And you'll see that the face, the beautiful Thutmose face of either Thutmose III or Hatshepsut, faces this post-Amarna face of the goddess Amunet on this square pillar block. Now, this block is an even more interesting one, because originally it was an 18th dynasty block, and this figure was the goddess Mut, and this figure was the king. And in the time of Ramses III, by then, you could see the leftover picking and chiseling that had happened in the Amarna period, but they had smoothed most of it out. And in the Ramessid period, they changed the Mut into Amun-Re, and they changed the king into Mut, shaking her sistra in front of her husband. So now, what was special about the form of worship of Mut as the daughter of Re and the Uraeus goddess? And that brings us to the festivals of drunkenness, which we have looked into in the Temple of Mut. So now we know that up until late in the 18th dynasty, this was a temple for the Uraeus goddess Mut Sekhmet Bastet, or Mut Bastet Sekhmet, and that goddess was an agent of the sun god, who on the one hand could bring all sorts of high Niles to the country when Re is happy, could have everything be on time in the year, the seasonal year, but who could also deliver pestilence when she is angry and when Re is angry. And these festivals were designed to be able to allow people to immediately converse with her, to communicate with this goddess, to actually ask her and to flatter her on the one hand, or to ask her to do something else. So there is something very special about Uraeus goddesses and those that are associated particularly with the goddess Hathor. And they have a form of worship that doesn't exist in any other gods or goddesses temples in Egypt. And this is a form of ritual drunkenness. And it is a unusual form of worship that brings everyone together. Everyone acts in a union, and they are led by not necessarily the hierarchical high priest, but rather by a master of secrets who reads the liturgies, and people enact activities and eventually bring the goddess into their midst. Now, when we started finding these column drums in the porch of Mut Temple, 6 of them bore the inscription, "She made it as a monument for her mother Mut, the mistress of Ishiru, making for her a columned porch," here's the hieroglyph, "of drunkenness," and there's the word for drunkenness, "anew," implying that there had been one there before, but probably it had been built of wood and mud brick, that she might perform given life. So underneath one of those columns was actually a smashed mid-18th dynasty drinking cup. So there's a hint right there. Now, this is where we think that the Hall of Drunkenness was located in the time of Hatshepsut, and was probably then taken down in the sole reign of Thutmose III. It was located to the side of the main temple itself. And in fact, it turns out that when you actually find places where the festivals of drunkenness were celebrated, and they had spaces dedicated to them, they do tend to be on the side, just as at Deir el-Bahri, where Hathor's shrine is located to the side of the main temple of Deir el-Bahri, and at Dendera, where Hathor's festival of drunkenness had a pathway that actually took it through and then outside on the side of a particular doorway. So this is where it came out. And when it came out there, in the late Ptolemaic and Roman periods, there would be the townspeople waiting for the festival procession to come out and bring the statue of Hathor to celebrate the drunkenness. Now, at Mut, we know the ritual calendar actually specifies 2 different rituals that were festivals of drunkenness. One of them is well known from the Temple of Dendera itself, much later, of course, and that is in the first month of the Egyptian year, the month of Thoth. And it is part of Mut's celebration as well. But the second one is a very, very well-known festival associated with Luxor itself, and that is the beautiful Feast of the Valley, which began on the eastern side of the river with the god Amun-Re, Mut, and Khonsu going across the Nile to the funerary temples of the kings in the middle of the 18th dynasty, specifically to Deir el-Bahri, where Hathor's shrine was. And after communing there and celebrating deceased rulers, the people of the city would gather and split up and go to the tombs of their loved ones that were on the western bank. And when they did, they would then have banquets with their deceased relatives and continue the festival of drunkenness, by means of which they would, through drinking and by the hallucinatory activity associated with drugged wine, experience the goddess directly. Now, Herodotus actually attended a festival like this and described it in Book 2 when he went to Bubastis. And I'm not going to read this long thing, but it is very clearly describing what it's like to have gone to a festival of drunkenness. In the nearby temple at Medamud, 8 kilometers north of Karnak, there is a Ptolemaic period hymn that actually describes what happens at the time of a festival of drunkenness. There, the goddess Rayet, which is the feminine form of the sun god Re, was one of these Uraeus goddesses. So it begins as nighttime comes on. They come into the front court of the temple, which had huge columns that are marked like a marsh with papyrus columns and called the place of inebriation and traveling through the marshes. And they talk about how the lector will begin to read the texts and intone, and everything is read. But then everyone begins to have their own set of activities. The young women are decorating the statues, and people drink until they are absolutely drunken, drunk so badly that they actually fall asleep. It is the intention here that the alcohol was certainly spiked with a variety of herbs that were soporifics. And this way they would fall asleep fairly early on, maybe midnight, and then very soon thereafter, a few hours later, there were drummers who would come in and beat their hand drums to awaken all of the celebrants. And when that happened, they had an epiphany. The whole group came together. A statue of the deity was carried into the midst of the group, and they then saw the goddess, and she saw them. And in ancient Egyptian, the word ma'a means not to simply see, but to see in the sense of actually communicate directly through all of that, this world and the next. Now, from the point of view of the beautiful feast, they would have then carried the statue of the goddess over to Deir el-Bahri, following a celebration that took place and an enactment that took place in the Mut Temple. And when they did that, part of the celebration actually was something that the king herself or himself would have enacted. And that was a very specific rite called Seker Hema, or striking the ball. It almost looks like baseball. There's a stick, and the king holds a ball, and he strikes it, and strikes 4 balls, 1 to each corner, northeast, south, and west, in order to rid the world of the evil, of the enemies of the sun god. And so for that reason, one of the things that is asked at the time of the festival of drunkenness, at the time of the Epiphany, is the punishment of enemies of the ruler and enemies of the god. But at the same time, the other thing that is asked is the blessing that takes place. Now, when people are then later in their visiting their relatives, you'll notice that banquets in Egyptian tombs of the 18th dynasty are very frequent. There are always musicians, and there are always lots of banqueters, but there is often also very little food. They're being offered alcohol, but just a tiny bit of food. And you will have songs that are sung at this time as the people are gathering in order to drink. They even say that Mut, and this is the song right here, and this is the words from it. Mut has come as the faraway one of the beautiful face in order to cause her sistrum players to cry out, desiring drunkenness from a goblet of gold. Now, in the tomb that everyone may have gone to who's visited Egypt, the tomb of Paheri and El Kab, there is a fascinating conversation that takes place on the wall here between a group of women who are at a banquet. And you see the butler is serving them alcohol. Now, in a few occasions, there are people like this lady and that lady who have their hands up in a gesture of refusal. They're not drinking. The rest of them are more than happy to drink the alcohol that is being offered to them. So the butler says, for your ka, drink until drunkenness, make festival, and hear what your relatives are saying. Don't be tired or tiresome, perhaps. And this one is saying, give me 18 jars of wine. Behold, I desire to be drunk, for my insides are parched. And then we have another person who's refusing. So the butler says, drink, don't just eat. Look, I'll stay with you. Now that's something we know from much later Ptolemaic and Roman sources, where people agreed to be what we might call today designated drivers, people who didn't drink and who took care of people when they took this very precarious step to become ritually drunk. So here the butler is actually saying, don't worry, I'll stay with you. And then of course the last one in the row is just saying, drink, don't decay, drink it up, and then pass the cup to me. It comes from the mayor because in this case, they're very happy because somebody else is paying for the alcohol. So here we have all women in an environment where drunkenness was not something acceptable socially in ancient Egypt, but rather this is a ritual. This is something that enabled them to actually commune with their dead relatives. And in fact, when you find out who these women are, they're almost certainly all passed away already, but they are joining their living relatives in this case. Now, we have from the tomb of Rekhmire singers and musicians who are singing a song, and next to them, people who are being offered to drink. And what they are saying in this text is, but is it ma'at? Is it correct desiring drunkenness? And if you'll notice, the name of the goddess Maat has been turned to face in the direction of the question. And therefore, as Henry Fisher argued many, many years before anyone put this in the context of a drunkenness festival, that's because the answer is yes, it is ma'at. It is correct to desire drunkenness in this ritual context. So much so that even drinking to excess was perfectly fine, and we see people becoming ill as a result. That's probably not only over imbibing, but probably because of what is mixed into the wine that may very well have not set with people's stomachs quite well. But another thing that we find here is that once people have become extremely drunken, the next step, of course, is to show that to the gods by procreating. So we have people wandering off to have sexual relations, perhaps with their actual partners, perhaps with other people. And we know that very explicitly from Ptolemaic period documents and Roman period documents written in Demotic. But certainly in the New Kingdom, all of the indications would be very much the same as we see from images such as these on ostraca, where people are sexually active. Now, at the time of the final epiphany, I said that they would then address the goddess. So there are two standard addresses. One here is to say, excuse me, joy for the goddess, the king, and the people. And they say to the goddess, how beautiful are these praises, like the praises of Horus himself, and wants the king to be in her praise. And the second, however, is to save the people and the king from evil. So Hathor is then asked, how beautiful is what your Horus, your king, creates for you. May you save the king of Upper and Lower Egypt from every evil thing of this day. Now at Mut, we have one very specific request that was made to the goddess in the reign of Hatshepsut and by the high priest of Amun, Hapu-Seneb, and it's inscribed on his own statue, which was found by Benson and Gourlay in the temple. And what he says after invoking the goddess and waking her, as this is meant to do, he says, may you judge this matter which the king of Upper Egypt, Mot-Ka-Re, has spoken to you. O Sekhmet, may you be powerful of heart, be powerful indeed over those who hate her. So here is one of those two standards that Habu-Seneb has requested that Mut and Sekhmet protect Hatshepsut from those who hate her. And we know that actually Hatshepsut probably did have quite a few enemies. So that brings us now to the final sort of looking at this question in the Mut temple. This celebration was done ritually twice a year, but for different purposes. But it did allow a communal conversation by people with the goddess. And that also is part of the other rituals that took place there, where we know that the goddess was brought red beer. And she was brought red beer in the same way that the myth of the destruction of mankind talks about Sekhmet having been foiled and stopped from her bloodlust by having her drink the beer that had been tainted red across the fields of Egypt. And so in the temple of Mut, she is frequently at the festival that took place in the first month of the year, the festival of Thoth. She is given her red beer at that time. So that's sort of the end of where I am these days. We could certainly talk about a lot of things, but I want to thank you all for being here, and I hope that you all have stayed home safely.